cold, heavy water. It poured into his mouth and nose and pressed down on his chest as if someone were sitting on his ribs. He flinched, coughed, and opened his eyes. Above him was not a helicopter cabin. Above him was a tattered silk canopy. Rain drummed on the fabric and seeped through the holes right onto his face. He was being rocked and shaken. He was lying on something wooden, and 4 men were carrying that wooden structure on their shoulders. A palanquin. He was being carried in a palanquin. Daniel Shaw, 26 years old, senior geospatial intelligence analyst. Kid in a plane crash over Myanmar, more or less. He didn't know how much time had passed. A minute, an hour, a week. But his hands felt like someone else's. Thin, long fingers with calluses in unfamiliar places. On his wrist was a scar he'd never had before. He raised his hand to his face and saw that his skin was 2 shades lighter. His heart pounded so hard he felt like he was suffocating. Then it pounded again, and again. And at that moment, someone else's memories flooded into his mind. Not all at once, in bits and pieces, like files loading one after another. A name, Shen Lianzhou, 24 years old. An illegitimate son of the Shen aristocratic house. A scout in the Border Corps. 3 weeks ago, he received an imperial decree and the title of governor of Wanzhou province. His memory told him what that meant. Wanzhou, swamps, fog. 3 armies had entered and not returned in 40 years. A place where they send those they want to get rid of without getting their hands dirty. He had been sent there to die. Daniel lifted the curtain of his palanquin and looked outside. A gray-green wall of fog began 200 meters from the soggy road. It stood as if alive. Dense, opaque. It was breathing. He could see it moving slowly. It rolled in and receded like the surf. A swamp. Another swamp. The universe definitely had a sense of humor. He appreciated that. The porters stopped. A crooked wooden post jutted out of the mud ahead. The paint on it had almost peeled off, but the letters were still legible. The border of Wanzhou province. The porters set the palanquin down on the ground. Silently. Without a bow. One of them spat into the mud. They didn't go any further. Daniel climbed out and stood on the road. His silk clothes were soaked through and hung on him like a wet rag. He looked at his escort. 3 soldiers. One's hands were shaking. The second wouldn't look up. The third stared at the wall of fog with the expression of a man who'd just been told the date of his death. Behind them stood a skinny scribe with a wooden seal case pressed to his chest like a child. That was it. That was his entire army. That was his entire province. Daniel slowly turned toward the fog. He took a breath. The air smelled of rot and wet earth and something sweet. There was something else in that scent. Something alive. Not dead. Not rotten. Alive. He smiled. He knew how to read the swamps. It was the one thing he'd been best at in his past life. Reading terrain that kills. Finding solid ground beneath the sludge. Seeing a path where others saw only death. He took his first step past the post, then a second. Then he turned to the 3 terrified soldiers and the scrawny clerk. He told them they'd better follow him and step exactly in his footsteps. He told them that if anyone strayed even a single step to the side, he personally wouldn't bother to pull them out. That was a lie. He would have gone to get them. But they didn't need to know that. They set off. For the first 10 minutes, the road was still a road, wet, rutted, but firm. Then it began to give way. Then it vanished. In its place, beneath their feet, was brown sludge covered with duckweed. The soldier, his hands trembling, stopped. He said they couldn't go any further. He said there was nothing down there. Daniel crouched down. He took off his boot. He dipped his foot into the water. It was cold. Ankle deep. The bottom. Solid clay. He closed his eyes and froze. And that's when it happened for the first time. Something clicked in his head. It was as if a screen that hadn't been there before had turned on. He sensed the bottom. Not with his foot, but with his mind. He could see it. A 3-dimensional map unfolded in his mind of its own accord, effortlessly. The density of the soil, the depth of the water, the slope, the current. A faint underground current flowed from right to left, eroding the top layer of clay 30 paces ahead. There would be a pit there, a deep one, 1.5 meters. To the left of the pit, the soil held firm. Further to the left, a nest began. Something large, warm, asleep. He opened his eyes. The map was still there. It hung in his mind like a second layer of vision, clear and precise. Daniel put on his boot and stood up. He pointed to the left and said they would go that way. The clerk asked how he knew. Daniel replied that he could see it. The scribe looked at him as if he were crazy, but he followed. They all followed, because there was no choice. They walked for 2 hours. Daniel led them in zigzags. He skirted around pits that looked like a solid trail. He walked straight through puddles that looked like bottomless swamps, but were actually only knee-deep. Once, he abruptly stopped everyone with a raised hand and stood motionless for a minute. Then he pointed to a thicket of reeds 20 paces to the right, and said that something large was sleeping there and that they needed to move quietly. The soldiers held their breath for the next 50 paces. When they passed through the reeds, a low, gurgling sound rang out, as if something had rolled over in its sleep. Heavy, very heavy. The ground beneath their feet trembled. They quickened their pace. By evening, the fog began to thicken. Visibility dropped to 10 paces, then to 5. Daniel stopped. He sensed something solid ahead. Stone. Man-made. They reached the tower 3 minutes later. A watchtower, 2 stories high, built of gray stone. Half the roof had collapsed. The door had rotted away and was hanging by a single hinge. But the walls were still standing, and inside, it was dry, relatively speaking. Daniel went in first. The floor was stone. The staircase leading upstairs was still intact. Upstairs was a landing with the remains of a railing. A view of fog in every direction. Nothing was visible. But he could sense it. The map in his head kept working. It showed him everything he'd traveled that day. Every step, every pit, every current, every nest. And at the edges of the map was white, the unknown. It weighed a slight unease, as if a tooth that wasn't there was itching. He wanted to know what was there. He wanted to go there and fill the void. But not now. The soldiers had built a fire in the corner, using the debris from the furniture they'd found inside. The scribe took not only his seal, but also a small bundle of dried rice from his case. They cooked porridge in a helmet. Daniel ate and thought. Shen Lianzhou's memories provided him with the details. 7 villages. People lived within a 2-day journey of this tower. Fishermen. Gatherers. Those whom the empire had forgotten. They paid a tax that no one ever came to collect. They buried their children every spring when the waters rose. They survived. But they didn't live. Daniel finished his porridge and set his helmet on the floor. He looked at the 3 soldiers sitting by the fire, trying not to look out the windows where the fog hung. He said that tomorrow they would go to the nearest village. He said he needed to speak with the elders. The soldier who had been shaking his hands earlier asked why. Daniel replied that he was going to draw a map. The soldier said it was impossible to draw a map of these swamps. 3 armies had tried. 3 armies never returned. Daniel replied that the 3 armies had gone with swords. He had come with his eyes. The difference was significant. The soldier fell silent. The clerk jotted down these words in his notebook. He wrote down everything the new administrator said. A habit. Or an order from someone in the capital. Daniel noticed this but said nothing. Let him write. Let him send reports. The more they in the capital thought of him as a harmless eccentric with an obsession for drawing maps, the more time he would have. He lay down on the stone floor and closed his eyes. The map in his head pulsed. White spots at the edges pulled him toward them, and where somewhere far away, very far away, deeper than the bottom, deeper than the underground currents, something stirred. Not threatening, not hostile, curious. As if something huge and ancient had opened one eye and looked at him, and thought. Finally, Daniel fell asleep. He didn't dream of anything, only silence and the feeling that someone was waiting patiently. Morning came without the sun. The fog hung so thick that Daniel couldn't see the tower's wall from 3 steps away. He was the first to get up. Shen Lianzhou's body was wiry and light, not strong, but resilient. The muscles of a scout. A man accustomed to walking a lot and eating little. Daniel stepped out onto the 2nd floor landing and closed his eyes. The map in his head was still there. Everything he'd seen yesterday remained. Every bump, every dip, every undercurrent. and the white spots all around. They were pulling at him. They itched like an unhealed wound. He opened his eyes and looked at the fog. It was thick. The humidity felt like it was over 90. There was no wind. The temperature was slightly above nighttime levels. The fog would start to lift in 3 or 4 hours. He didn't know how he knew, but he knew. Just as he'd known yesterday about the pit and the nest. His body remembered the swamps. His ability could read them. He went downstairs. The soldiers were asleep. The clerk was sitting by the extinguished campfire, writing in his notebook. Daniel sat down next to him. He asked the clerk his name. The man flinched. His name was Wen Ji, 20 years old, junior secretary at the Western Border Office, sent to accompany the new administrator. Wen Ji clearly hadn't expected the administrator to speak to him. Daniel asked if he could draw. Wen Ji replied that his handwriting was considered the best in his class. Daniel said he didn't need handwriting. He needed someone who could put down on paper what he described in words. Lines, depths, marks. Wen Ji blinked and said he'd try. Daniel nodded. Then he woke the soldiers. He learned their names. Gao Jian, 28, the one whose hands were shaking. A former infantryman from a disbanded border garrison. His hands were shaking not from fear, from an old concussion. He was the sole survivor of a skirmish with nomads 2 years ago. Li Feng, 31, a man of few words. He didn't look up, stripped of his rank for drunkenness, but his shoulders were broad and he moved with economy. A man who knew how to fight. Zhou Bai, 22, the youngest, the one who looked at the fog as if it were his own grave. A recruit, his first posting. He'd been sent here because he hadn't paid the right person to get transferred to a normal garrison. 4 of them. A clerk and 3 soldiers, and the swamp all around. Daniel gathered them at the entrance to the tower. The fog began to lift. He was right. 3.5 hours. Through the whitish veil, the outlines of reeds and gnarled trees began to emerge. Daniel said they were heading for the nearest village. Lianzhou's memory suggested the direction. Northwest. A 2-hour walk if you knew the way. None of them knew the way. But Daniel had a map, and the map grew with every step. They walked on. Daniel led the way. He placed his foot down. He felt the bottom. The map in his head filled in on its own. Every new meter filled in a blank spot. He began to mutter. A habit from a past life. When he worked with a tablet in the helicopter, he always spoke the data aloud. Depth 30. Dense soil. Current on the left. Slow speed. Being washed away. In 20 steps, the bottom will drop. Veer 10 to the right. Wen Ji followed behind him, taking notes. He didn't understand half the words, but he wrote everything down. An hour later, they came across the first sign of human presence. A pole driven into a mound of earth, with a faded rag tied to it. Daniel stopped and looked at the pole. A trail. Someone had marked the trail. He crouched down and felt the mud around the post. Footprints. Fresh. Someone had passed through here this morning. Bare feet. Small ones. A child or a teenager. He stood up and looked ahead. The trail led into the reeds. The map in his head showed that the trail was safe. For now. But 40 steps ahead lay a zone he couldn't see. A white spot. A pang of alarm shot through the back of his head. He didn't like white spots. He quickened his pace. They covered 30 steps, then 40. The white spot began to fill in, and Daniel stopped. Ahead, the trail looked solid, a firm mound covered in moss. But the map in his head was screaming in red. There was no bottom beneath the mound. At all. Just a thin layer of intertwined roots and moss. Beneath it, water. Deep. Cold. With a current strong enough to sweep him away. And standing at the edge of this trap was a child. A boy of about 10. Barefoot. Skinny. With a basket on his back. He was standing at the edge, about to step onto the mound. Daniel shouted. He shouted the first word that came to mind in the Shen Lianzhou language. Stop! The boy froze. He turned around. His eyes were huge, frightened, not from the shout, from seeing strangers. Strangers didn't come here. Daniel approached slowly. He pointed at the mound and told him there was no bottom there. The boy didn't believe him. He'd walked this path dozens of times. The mound had always been there. Daniel picked up a long stick from the ground and poked it into the center of the mound. The stick went right through. The green carpet of moss and roots parted like fabric, revealing the black water. The stick went in 1.5 meters but didn't reach the bottom. The boy looked at the hole, then at Daniel, then back at the hole. His face went pale. He'd walked here dozens of times. But the mound had dried out over the last month. The roots had rotted. One more step and he would have fallen through, with the basket on his back, into the icy water, down the current. The boy sat down on the ground. He was shaking. Daniel took off his outer robe and draped it over the boy's shoulders. He asked where the village was. The boy pointed. Close by, behind the reeds. Daniel took him by the hand and led him along a detour, 10 minutes longer, but every step was on solid ground. The village stood on stilts, or rather, it had once stood on stilts. Now half the stilts had rotted away, and the houses were leaning. Some had sunk entirely into the water. All that remained were roofs sticking out of the brown sludge like gravestones. There were 12 inhabited houses, about 70 people. The boy turned out to be the elder's grandson. When the elder saw the wet child in a silk robe slung over a stranger's shoulder, he stepped to the edge of the platform and looked at Daniel. For a long time, in silence. Then he asked who he was. Daniel said he was the new governor of Wanj province. The elder didn't laugh. He wasn't surprised. He just nodded. Another fool. Sent here to die. They all came that way. Not a single one had survived longer than 2 months. Daniel asked that the elders from the nearest villages be gathered. The elder asked why. Daniel replied that he wanted to draw a map for them. The elder said that maps were useless. The swamp changes every season. What was a road yesterday will be a pit tomorrow. Daniel replied that that was exactly why he needed a map. Not just one, 4. One for each season. The elder looked at him again. Something had changed in his gaze. Not trust. It was too early for trust. Interest. Small, cautious, but alive. He said he would send for the elders. Daniel nodded and asked to be shown around the village. For the next 2 hours, he walked along the boardwalks. He looked at the pilings. He touched the wood. He checked the supports with his foot. He closed his eyes and felt the currents beneath the floor. The map was taking shape. The village was being laid out on it layer by layer. Depths, currents, wear on the posts, wind direction. Places where the water stagnated and rotted, places where it flowed. By evening, he knew this village better than the people who had lived there their whole lives. And he knew it was dying. Not from creatures, not from the fog, from the water. The stagnant water beneath the houses was rotting and corroding the pilings. In 2 years, the village would sink to the bottom. All 12 houses, all 70 people. Unless they did one simple thing. Daniel found the village elder and told him. He said they needed to dig a ditch. Just one. From the western edge of the village to the channel. 20 paces long, waist deep. The water would start to flow. It would stop rotting. The pilings would last another 10 years. The elder asked how he knew. Daniel said he could see it. The same words he'd said to the scribe. The same words he'd say 1,000 more times. The elder was silent for a moment. Then he said he would send people tomorrow to dig. Daniel lay down to sleep on the wooden floor. Water gurgled beneath him. Fog hung above him. The map in his head pulsed. There were fewer white spots, but there were still many. So many that the anxiety wouldn't let him go, even in his sleep. And again, far away, deep down, something stirred, something was waiting. The elders arrived 3 days later, 7 of them, from 7 villages. Each had traveled his own way because there was no single road connecting the settlements. Daniel waited for them in the watchtower. He'd managed to get a lot done in those 3 days. They dug the ditch in the first village in a single day, 20 paces long, a belt's width deep. When the last clump of mud was cleared away, the water began to flow. Slowly. Murky. But it flowed. The stagnant brown sludge beneath the houses began to move. By evening, the stench of rot had already subsided. The elder of the first village stood at the edge of the ditch and silently watched the flowing water. He said nothing. But in the morning, he sent Daniel some dried fish, 3 bundles. By the standards of a village where people ate bark in the winter, it was like being given gold. Daniel accepted it. He knew the value of such a gesture. Over those same 3 days, he had walked around the tower's surroundings twice. The map in his mind had expanded. 15 li in every direction. He knew every trail, every pit, every nest. 3 colonies of marsh birds to the northeast, a roost of large amphibians to the south, an underground current of warm water to the east, and 1 nest, huge, to the west. The Muddy Lord. The locals called it that and never went in that direction. Daniel approached to within 200 paces and stopped. The map was screaming. The creature was big, very big. He couldn't see it, just an outline in the ground, footprints, furrows. Fallen trees all snapped in the same direction. The animal was moving, slowly, in circles, patrolling the territory, a cycle of about 8 hours. It eats at dawn, sleeps in the middle of the day, patrols at night. Daniel noted everything in his head and left. Leave it alone for now. Observe. Now the elders were sitting before him in the tower. 7 elderly people. Weather-beaten faces, hands covered in calluses, eyes with that look people have when they're used to loss. They'd come because they'd heard about the ditch and the rescued boy. But mostly they'd come to look at the new fool. Daniel took out a soggy imperial map of the province and spread it out on the table. The map was useless. The border lines didn't match reality. The depth markings were made up. The trails didn't exist. It was a map drawn by a bureaucrat who had never been to Wanja. Daniel picked up a piece of charcoal and began drawing over it. He drew in silence. 30 minutes. The elders watched. At first with indifference, then with surprise, then with something resembling fear. He was drawing things he couldn't possibly know. An underground current to the east that the locals had discovered only 10 years ago. The nesting grounds of the marsh ravens that every hunter kept secret. Areas of solid bottom that the villages had passed down from generation to generation. And the death zones. Daniel marked them in black. Places where the bottom dropped off, where the current pulled you under, where the ground looked solid but gave way under the weight of an adult. He marked one spot and drew a small cross next to it. One of the elders, a gray-haired fisherman with a scar running across his cheek, stood up. He walked over to the map and pointed to that spot. His finger trembled. He said that his son had drowned here 8 years ago. The trail was considered safe. They hadn't told anyone. Daniel nodded. He said the trail was safe for 3 months of the year, from the 9th to the 11th. The rest of the time, an underground current erodes the top layer and the ground gives way. He said he would draw up a table by month and bring it tomorrow. Silence fell over the tower, the kind of silence that comes when people realize the world has just changed. Not loud, not with a crash. Quiet, like water that has begun to move in a ditch. One of the elders took off his hat, then a second, then all 7. It was a gesture of respect in these parts. Daniel didn't know that. Lien Zhou's memory did. He bowed his head in response. Then he spoke. He spoke at length. He explained in simple terms because 21st century words didn't work here. He said that the swamp was not the enemy. The swamp was home. But one had to study home. You need to know where the walls are and where the floor is, where the doors are and where the traps are. He said he wanted to build a road, not just 1, 7, from each village to the tower. Pile roads over the water. He explained the principle. Alder piles because alder doesn't rot in water. The decking would be made of split bamboo. The railings would be made of ropes. He explained and drew diagrams. Wenji transcribed his words onto paper. The elders listened. One asked where they would get the alder. Daniel pointed to a spot in the northeast on the map. A grove. 40 trees. Enough for the first section. Another asked who would do the building. Daniel replied that they would all build it. Each village is responsible for its own section. He'll show them how to drive the piles. He'll show them where to drive them. A third elder asked why. Why was he doing this? Why would a government official from the capital build roads for fishermen? Daniel paused. Then he replied that he wasn't a government official from the capital. He was a manager. His job was to make sure people didn't drown. It was that simple. The elder with the scar snorted, but not mockingly, with something like bitter tenderness. The way one looks at a man who says naive things, but has just proven that he knows more about the swamp than anyone else alive. The meeting ended by nightfall. The elders left. Each took a copy of the map with them. Wen-ji made 7 copies. His hand was so tired he could barely hold the brush. Daniel stayed in the tower. Gao Jian stood on the 2nd floor, gazing into the fog. His hands didn't tremble. He turned to Daniel and said that in 2 days, he hadn't seen a single thing he couldn't explain. A ditch. 3 attempts. A map. It all made sense. And that frightened him more than the swamp. Because if the administrator is right, if all of this works, then the previous 3 armies perished not because the swamp was impassable. They perished because no one bothered to read it. Daniel looked at him and nodded. Exactly. Gao Jian clenched his jaw. Then he said that if the overseer was building roads, he would need protection. He didn't know how to do much, but he knew how to stand between a person and danger. It was the first voluntary offer of loyalty Daniel had received in this world. He accepted it with a nod, without words. That night, Daniel lay on the stone floor and stared at the ceiling. The map in his head was filling in. Slowly, day by day, he saw a pattern. The swamp was a system, a vast, complex, living system. The currents fed off one another. The creatures' nests were not arranged at random. They followed the warmth. They followed the food. The cycles of the fog. Everything was connected. And the deeper he looked, the clearer it became that the system wasn't chaotic. It was organized. Not by nature, by something else. This thought kept him awake. He lay there and listened to the swamp breathe. And the swamp listened to him breathe. Construction of the first road began a week after the meeting. Daniel chose a stretch between the first village and the tower. The distance was about 2 li. Not the longest route, but it was the most important one. The tower stood in the center. If all the roads converged on it, the tower would become a hub, a point from which one could reach any village. Daniel spent 2 days laying out the route. He walked the future path 8 times. Each time, he closed his eyes and felt the ground beneath him. He marked the spots where the soil held firm, where long piles were needed, where short ones were needed, where the current would erode the bank and retaining walls had to be built. Wen-ji followed behind him, driving in stakes with rags tied to them. A red rag meant a long pile. A blue one meant a short one. A yellow one meant danger. Do not set foot there. 12 people came to the village on the first day, 20 on the second, 30 on the third. People came from neighboring villages, not because they believed, but because they were curious. The new manager waded chest-deep in the water, poking the bottom with a stick and muttering numbers that no one understood. It was more interesting than sitting around and waiting for the house to sink. Daniel showed them how to chop down alder trees. Not all trunks were suitable, only those that grew near running water. They're denser, heavier, and rot more slowly. He demonstrated how to trim the butt end and how to drive a pile into the bottom at the correct angle, not vertically, slightly angled toward the current. That way, the water pressure would press the pile in rather than loosen it. The fisherman with the scar. The elder of the first village. His name was Chen Hai. He stood on the bank and watched as Daniel, chest deep in the brown water, drove the first pile into the ground with a stone hammer. Then he took off his shirt and waded into the water. He was over 60. He didn't say a word. He just stood beside Daniel and began holding the pile in place while Daniel struck it. By evening on the first day, 8 piles were in place. Daniel climbed out of the water and sat down on a mound. He was shivering from the cold. Lianzhou's body was resilient, but unaccustomed to spending hours in the icy water. Gao Jian brought him dry clothes and hot broth. Li Feng silently took off his cloak and draped it over him. It was a second gesture, a small one, a quiet one. But Daniel noticed it. 3 things happened during the first 2 weeks of construction. First, a letter arrived. A beautiful scroll in a silk case. The Shen family seal. The sender, Shen Yuanji, his older half-brother, the heir. The letter was warm, caring. Yuanji wrote that he was worried about his younger brother's health in such harsh conditions. He sent gifts, 3 jugs of wine from the capital, a bundle of expensive incense, and a servant, a young man named Luo Han. Quiet, attentive, with watchful eyes. Daniel read the letter. He thanked him. He set the wine in a corner and left it untouched. A habit. In his past life, while in the field, he never consumed anything he hadn't personally tested. Later, he asked Gaoko Jian to pour a little wine onto the ground near an ant trail. An hour later, the ants lay dead. 3 jugs, 3 different poisons. Someone really wanted to be sure. Daniel wasn't surprised. Lianzhou's memory had warned him. Yuanji was unforgiving. An illegitimate son receiving a title, even a meaningless one, was an insult. He had to be eliminated. Quietly, cleanly. Daniel sealed the jugs and put them away in storage. They'd come in handy. He didn't send away Luo Han, the new servant. He assigned him to haul water for the construction and carry stones. Hard, pointless work, far from anything important. Luo Han smiled and carried on. Jessica Park watched him. She showed up at the end of the first week. Daniel had forgotten about her. She'd been part of his escort from the very beginning, one of the 3 soldiers. No, not one of the 3. She'd arrived separately, riding a scrawny horse. It was the second day after their arrival at the tower. He hadn't paid her any mind at the time. A woman in military uniform with reconnaissance corps insignia. Stripped of her rank. Exiled. Officially, she was part of the escort garrison. Unofficially, she was the only professional among them. Daniel realized this when he saw how she moved. Quietly. Efficiently. Without any unnecessary movements. She didn't walk on the planks. She glided. Without making a sound. On the 3rd day of construction, she approached him and silently placed a note on the table. A list. 4 names. 4 people among the workers who had come from distant villages. They weren't working. They were watching. Memorizing the layout. Counting people. They were taking notes. Jessica said that 2 of them carried knives that fishermen wouldn't need. One had calluses from a bow. The 4th was too clean for someone who'd spent 2 days walking through the swamp. Daniel looked at the list. Then at her. He asked what she was suggesting. She suggested quietly taking them out at night. Daniel shook his head. He said not to get rid of them, to watch them. It's more useful to know they're here than not to know. Let them watch. Let them count. Let them send reports. The more boring the reports, the better. Road construction. Ditches. Maps. Boring. Safe. Not worth paying attention to. Jessica looked at him. He saw something new in her eyes. Not surprise. Recognition. She recognized in him a way of thinking that was familiar to her. Reconnaissance. Not combat. Information. Not force. She nodded and left. From that day on, Daniel knew the location of every stranger within a 5-li radius. Not because he saw them on a map, because Jessica saw them through her eyes. The second thing that happened. Mei Lin, a village herbalist from the 2nd village. She arrived on the 6th day of construction. Short, quiet, with a basket on her back and her hands stained green. She didn't come to help with the construction. She came because one of the workers had cut his leg on a rusty nail, and the wound had started to fester. Mei Lin washed the wound. She applied a compress made of moss that Daniel had never seen before. 2 days later, the wound had healed. Clean. No inflammation. Daniel walked over to her and asked what kind of moss it was. She answered reluctantly. Silver moss. It only grows in certain places. She gathers it once a month. It's barely enough. Daniel closed his eyes. The map. He found 3 spots on the map where he'd seen similar vegetation. He described the locations to her. She listened with growing skepticism. Then she asked how he knew. Same question. Same answer. He could see it. She went off to check. She returned 2 days later, with a basket full of silverweed. She hadn't gathered that much in half a year. She stood before him and stared silently. Then she sat down and began to cry. Not out of joy. Daniel didn't realize it right away. Wen Ji explained later. Mei Ling had a sister, a younger one. She had died of swamp fever 2 years ago. There was a cure, the root of a specific kind of water lily. But it grew in an area the villagers considered off-limits, the territory of the Muddy Lord. No one went there. Her sister had died because the plant they needed grew in a place no one dared to go. Daniel didn't say a word. The next morning, he set off alone. Gao Jian tried to stop him. Daniel said he needed to check something. He was heading west, toward the Muddy Lord's territory. The map showed that the creature was asleep at this time of day, deep down, in a pit at the southern edge of the territory. Daniel circled the pit in a wide arc. His heart was beating fast. Lianzhou's body moved silently. A scout's instincts were ingrained in his muscles. He found the lilies, white flowers on long stems. They grew in a thicket at the edge of the territory. He gathered a full bag of roots, carefully, without damaging the stems. They'll grow back. He returned in the evening. He found Mei Ling. Silently, he laid the roots on the table in front of her. She looked at the roots, then at him. She recognized the plant. She didn't ask where he'd found them. She knew. She covered her face with her hands and cried for a long time. 4 years. She hadn't cried for 4 years. Daniel left her alone. He stood on the deck and looked out at the swamp. He thought about the girl he didn't know, about the medicine that grew a 2-hour walk away, about the fear that kills more surely than any creature. From that day on, Mei Ling came every morning. She didn't ask for permission. She just started working. She sorted the plants. She made poultices. She treated cuts and colds. She wrote down what Daniel said about the properties of the soil and water. She began keeping her own notebook, alongside Wen Ji's. 2 people were writing down his every word, for different reasons. Daniel took this as a beginning. The first pile-supported road was completed on the 20th day. 2 rows of alder piles and bamboo planks ran in a straight line from Chenhai's village to the watchtower. Daniel stood at the edge of the road and watched as the first person walked along it. An old woman. Chenhai's grandmother. She was over 80. She hadn't left the village in 6 years because she couldn't walk through the swamp. Now she was walking on dry decking. Slowly, holding onto the rope railing. Her feet didn't touch the water. She reached the tower and stopped. She looked around. Then she turned to Daniel and said that she thought she would die without ever seeing anything but her village. Daniel didn't answer. He stood there watching the children follow her down the road. Running. For the first time in their lives, they could run between the village and the tower without watching their step, without counting their steps, without probing every bump with a stick. They ran and shouted. The sound of children's shouts over the swamp. A strange sound. Out of place. Yet right. Construction of the second road began that very day. Now Daniel had 40 workers. People from 3 villages. They came of their own accord. No one ordered them to. Daniel divided them into teams. Each team was responsible for its own section. He showed the foreman how to read his markings. A red rag, a blue rag, a yellow rag. A simple system. But it worked. He could no longer personally stand over every pile. He had to delegate. And so he began to teach. Not to command. To teach. Chenhai turned out to be a good builder. A fisherman's hands were used to water, to the cold, to precise work. He drove the piles straight and quickly. Daniel made him foreman of the first section of the second road. Chenhai accepted without a word. He just nodded. The first month passed. Daniel sat on the second floor of the tower and looked at the map that now covered the entire wall. Wen Ji had redrawn it onto a large piece of cloth. 15 li in every direction from the tower. Depths, currents, nests, trails. Seasonal changes were marked in 4 colors. The map was alive. Every day, new markings appeared on it. Daniel spent the day doing calculations. He calculated in his head. Without paper. Wen Ji wrote down the results. The population of the 7 villages, 412 people. Of those, 270 were able-bodied. 63 children under 10. 41 elderly people over 60. Current food supplies: rice, dried fish, roots, and seaweed. At the current rate of consumption, it would last 2 months. Then famine would set in. Every year at this time, famine began. And every year the weakest died. Children, the elderly, those whom the swamp hadn't killed directly died because the swamp didn't provide enough food. Daniel looked at the numbers. He needed a farm. Not on land. There was no land here. On water. A floating farm. He knew the principle. He'd seen something similar in Myanmar and Cambodia. Floating gardens on Inle Lake. A base of interwoven algae and reeds. Anchors made of stones tied to ropes. a layer of fertile silt on top. You could grow rice on it, water rice that isn't afraid of flooding. The problem was that he'd never done this himself. He'd seen it. He understood the principle. But between the principle and the actual construction lay a chasm filled with mistakes. He needed someone who knew the local plants. He called for Mei Lin. She came and sat down beside him. He explained the idea. A floating platform made of reeds with silt on top and rice. Mei Lin listened in silence. Then she said the reeds wouldn't hold up. They'd rot within a season. But there's another plant, iron grass. It grows in shallow water. The stems are hollow and hard as wood. It doesn't rot in the water for years. You can weave a base out of it. Daniel asked where it grew. Mei Lin pointed to the map. 3 dots, all within 5 li. Daniel looked at her and for the first time thought that the universe hadn't just sent him to a swamp. It had sent him to a swamp where the right people were already there.
He just had to find them.
It took 10 days to build the first floating farm. Mei Lin gathered iron grass. Fishermen from Chenhaya village wove the framework. Daniel calculated the size, shape, and planting depth. The farm turned out to be small, 10 steps by 15, a flat platform on the water, a layer of silt as thick as a palm, rice planted in rows, anchors made of stones wrapped in rope. When the platform was lowered into the water, Daniel held his breath. It could sink. It could tip over. It could fall apart. The platform swayed. It settled by 2 fingers width. And then it stood. Level. Steady. Water lapped at the edges but didn't flood the surface. Daniel exhaled. Mei Lin stood nearby, looking at the rice floating on the water. She said quietly that if this worked, no one would starve to death next spring. Daniel looked at her. He said it would work. He was lying. He wasn't sure. But she needed to hear that. Meanwhile, a third important thing happened. Luo Han, the servant sent by Yuanji. He worked. He hauled stones. He carried water. He smiled. And waited. Jessica watched him every day. On the 25th day, he made his move. At night, Daniel was sleeping on the 2nd floor of the tower. Luo Han climbed the stairs. A thin knife in his hand. He moved silently. Professionally silent. He walked past the sleeping Gao Jian, past Wen Ji. He approached Daniel, who was lying there, to within arm's reach, and stopped. Because the tip of a sword was pressed against his throat from behind. Jessica was standing behind him. She hadn't slept for 25 nights, waiting for this moment. Luo Han froze. The knife fell from his hand. Daniel opened his eyes. He hadn't been asleep. He'd been lying there, waiting. He turned his head and looked at Luo Han. A young face. Frightened. But not the face of a fanatic. The face of a man carrying out an order because he had no choice. Daniel sat up. He asked Luo Han who had sent him. Luo Han remained silent. Jessica pressed the sword against his throat. A drop of blood trickled down his neck. Daniel raised his hand. He told Jessica to move the sword away. She didn't. He repeated himself. Quietly, firmly. She moved it away. Daniel stood up and walked over to Luo Han. He said he knew who had sent him. He said the wine had been poisoned with 3 different poisons. He said it was excessive and inelegant. And he said Luo Han could make a choice. Return to whoever sent him and report that the manager is dead. Or stay and build roads. Luo Han looked at him. For a long time. He asked what would happen if he went back and reported it. Daniel replied that he would probably be killed. People who send assassins don't like assassins who come back empty-handed. Luo Han closed his eyes. Then he opened them. He said he would stay. Daniel nodded. He said that tomorrow Luo Han would start working with Chen Hai on the 2nd section. Real work. Not rocks and water, piles and decking. Luo Han nodded. Jessica stood to the side and looked at Daniel, her face. But as he walked past her, she said quietly that he was either the smartest person she'd ever met or the most reckless. Daniel replied that there wasn't much of a difference. She almost smiled. Almost. The month was over. 2 pile-driven roads, 1 floating farm, 412 people who had begun to believe that maybe they wouldn't die next spring, 1 former killer who was now driving piles, 1 clerk who had filled 3 notebooks, One herbalist who smiled for the first time in 4 years. And deep beneath the swamp, something ancient and patient watched his every step. It waited, without haste. He had time. He had an infinite amount of time. For the first time in 1,000 years, he didn't need to hurry. The second month began with rain. He walked without stopping for 7 days. Not a downpour, a steady, heavy rain that pressed the fog into the ground and raised the water level 3 palms higher than usual. The 2 completed pile-supported roads held up. The deck rose above the water to waist height, and there was still a margin to spare. Daniel had calculated correctly. But the floating farm had shifted.
One of the anchor ropes had frayed against a rock, and the current had pulled the platform southward. Maylin ran to the tower before dawn and said the farm was being swept away. Daniel ran out into the rain. He closed his eyes and activated the map. The current. He could see it. The underwater current had intensified due to the rains and changed direction. It usually flowed from west to east. Now it was pushing from the northwest. The anchor on the south side took the full brunt of the force, and the rope snapped. Daniel ran toward the farm. Gao Jian and Li Feng followed him. They found the platform 100 steps from where it had been. It was slowly drifting toward the reed beds. If it got swept there, the reeds would entangle the base and the farm would collapse. Daniel jumped into the water. It was cold, up to his chest. He swam to the platform and grabbed the edge. The rice on the surface was intact. The water hadn't flooded the landing. The iron grass foundation was holding. Maylin was right. This plant never let them down. Gao Jian swam over with a rope. They tied it around the platform, and the 3 of them pulled it back. The current was strong. Their feet slid along the bottom. Li Feng braced his back against a road pile and pulled the rope over his shoulder. The veins in his neck bulged. He didn't make a sound. They pulled for an hour. People from the village came over. 5 of them. 10. They formed a chain and pulled. The platform was returned to its place. Daniel dove down and felt around the bottom with his hands. He found the rock to which the anchor was attached. The rock had shifted. It was too light. He surfaced and said they needed a heavier rock, 3 times as heavy, and a thicker rope. And not just 1 anchor on each side, but 2. Chen Hai nodded and sent the men to fetch the rocks. By evening, the raft had been secured again. 4 anchors instead of 2. Double ropes. Rocks that Li Feng could barely budge on land. Daniel stood on the shore, shivering. Lianzhou's body was protesting. The cold. The exhaustion. He hadn't eaten since morning. Mei Ling approached and silently handed him a cup of hot herbal tea. Bitter, but warming. She told him he needed to sleep. He replied that he needed to think. The farm had shown a weakness. He hadn't accounted for seasonal changes in the currents. His map showed the usual directions. But the rain changed everything. He needed data from several seasons to build a complete model. He didn't have that data. He'd only been living here for a month. He needed someone who'd lived here all his life. He went to see Che Hai. The old fisherman was sitting under a shed, mending his net. Daniel sat down next to him and asked about the currents. Chen Hai spoke for 2 hours. He shared everything he'd known his whole life, how the water rises in the spring, how it recedes in the fall, how the currents change when it rains, where the warm water comes from in winter, where it goes in summer. He didn't know why it happened, but he knew what happened and when. Daniel listened, and the map in his head was being redrawn. A new ray. Seasonal. Spring, summer, fall, winter. 4 different swamps in the very same place. 4 different sets of currents. 4 different hazard maps. He finally understood why the 3 armies hadn't returned. They'd entered the swamp in a single season. The swamp had changed. The trails had vanished. The currents had shifted. Safe areas had become traps. The armies were following maps that had become obsolete in a week. They were relying on memories that lied. The swamp didn't kill. The swamp changed. And those who entered it didn't change with it. Daniel clenched his fists. He wouldn't make that mistake. His map would be a living one. It would change along with the swamp. The next day, he began building a monitoring system. A simple one. 6 points. 6 posts with notches at water level.
Every day, one person from the nearest village would go to a post and mark the level. Once a week, the data would be brought to the tower. Wenji records the data. In 3 months, Daniel will have a table of water level changes at the 6 points. In a year, he'll have a complete seasonal picture. It was slow, painfully slow. In his past life, he'd had drones and satellites and real-time data. Here, he had notched sticks and boys running back and forth between them. But the principle was the same. Data, regular, cross-referenced, reliable. While he was setting up the monitoring system, a second attack occurred. Not on him, on the road. During the night, someone had sawed through 3 piles in the first section. Not all the way through, leaving a thin layer, enough for the pile to stand. Not enough to support the weight of several people at once. In the morning, a group of 8 fishermen was walking along the road. The first one crossed. The second one crossed. When 4 of them stepped onto the sawed-through section at the same time, the pile cracked. The deck sagged. 2 fell into the water. 1 hit his head on a neighboring pile. They pulled him out with a lacerated forehead. There was a lot of blood. The wound wasn't fatal, but it could have been. Daniel examined the pile. Saw marks. Even. Deliberate. It wasn't rot. It was sabotage. He knelt in the water and studied the cut. His hands didn't tremble. But something dark was rising inside him. Who had tried to destroy what they were building? Not to kill him. To destroy trust. If people start to be afraid to walk on the roads, then the roads are useless. If the roads are useless, then the villages are isolated again. If the villages are isolated, then the province is dead. It was a precise strike. Professional. Not Luo Han. He had been building alongside the others, and his hands were covered in calluses. Jessica had checked. It was someone else. Daniel gathered the elders. He showed them the sawed-off pile. He didn't try to hide anything. He didn't downplay it. He said outright that someone wanted to prevent the roads from being built. He said it could happen again. He said he needed night patrols, 2 people on every section of the road every night. Chen Hai was the first to stand up. He said his men would take the watch. The other elders agreed. Not all of them. The elder from the 3rd village. His name was Peng Wei, a thin man with sharp eyes. He remained silent at every meeting and looked at Daniel as if waiting for him to make a mistake. Peng Wei asked how they could be sure the manager himself hadn't sawed through the pile. To scare people. To force them to obey. The tower fell silent. Daniel looked at Peng Wei. He wasn't angry. The question was reasonable. He replied that Peng Wei had every right not to believe him. He said he wouldn't force the issue. He said the road to Peng Wei's village would be built last. Not as a punishment. Because building a road for people who don't trust it is dangerous. They won't maintain it. They won't repair it. They won't protect it. And the road will collapse. And when it collapses, Peng Wei will say he was right. Daniel said he would wait. Until Peng Wei saw that the other roads were standing and serving their purpose. Until his village was the only one without a road. Then Peng Wei would come on his own. Peng Wei clenched his jaw and left. Chen Hai looked at Daniel and shook his head. He said that Peng Wei wasn't a bad person. He was still innocent. He had been deceived many times. Daniel nodded. He knew. He could see it in Peng Wei's eyes. Not anger, weariness. Weariness from promises that no one keeps. Night patrols began that very night. Jessica organized them. Quietly, precisely. 2 people on each section. Shifts every 4 hours. An alarm signal. 3 strikes on the stake. The sound carried far across the water. On the 3rd night, the patrol spotted a shadow. A man was approaching the road from the south, across the water, silently. The sentries struck the stake. 3 strikes. The shadow vanished into the reeds. They couldn't catch up to him. But Jessica found a trail in the morning. 1 person, military-style boots, not a villager. She showed the tracks to Daniel. He nodded. The 4 spies she'd uncovered earlier had left a week ago. Quietly, one by one. Their work was done. Now someone else had arrived. Not an observer, an operator. Daniel asked Jessica what she thought. She replied briefly, a professional. 1 person, working alone. Most likely sent by the same person who sent Luo Han. Yuanji was changing tactics. The wine hadn't worked. The knife hadn't worked. Now, destruction. If the roads fall, So will trust. If trust collapses, the governor will be left alone. A man alone in the swamp doesn't survive for long. Daniel stood on the tower and gazed into the fog. He thought of his half-brother, whom he had never seen through the eyes of Daniel Shaw. Only through the eyes of Lianzhou, his memory prompted him. Yuanji, 31 years old, handsome, intelligent, charming. His father's favorite, the court's favorite. A man who never did the dirty work himself. A man who sincerely believed that a son born out of wedlock who had achieved even the slightest success was a mistake that needed to be corrected. Not out of cruelty, out of a sense of order. The world is arranged in a certain way. Illegitimate sons do not succeed. If they do, it means the world is broken. Yuanji was fixing the world, in his own way. Daniel understood this logic, and that understanding was harder to bear than anger. He came down from the tower and went to Jessica. He told her two things. First, find the saboteur. Second, don't kill him. Jessica raised an eyebrow. Daniel explained. A dead saboteur would be replaced by another. A living saboteur under their control is a communication channel. Through him, they can send information back to Yuanji, the information they want Yuanji to receive. Jessica looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. She began the hunt. Quiet. Patient. A hunt through the marshes. Jessica found the saboteur on the 9th day of the hunt. He was hiding on a small island about 2 li south of the tower. A small, dry mound amid the reeds, invisible from any trail. Daniel didn't know about this island because he'd never passed by it. A blank spot on the map. He'd felt a slight unease in that direction but hadn't thought much of it. Now he did. Jessica led him there at night. They waded through water up to their waists, without a torch, without a sound. Jessica moved like a fish. Her feet found the bottom with a precision that frightened Daniel. She'd spent a month in the swamp and already moved like a local. On the islet stood a tiny tent made of oiled canvas. Inside, a man was sleeping. Middle-aged, wiry, short hair. A military bearing even in his sleep. Next to him lay a bag of tools. A saw, a knife, a rope, a small crossbow with 3 bolts, and a sealed bamboo tube containing a letter. Jessica woke him with the tip of her sword. He didn't flinch. He opened his eyes, looked at the sword, then at Jessica, then at Daniel standing behind her shoulder. His name was Jiang Mo, a former sergeant in the reconnaissance corps. Discharged 3 years ago. A mercenary. Specialization, covert operations, sabotage. He didn't put up a fight. A professional who knows when the game is over. He wasn't hired directly by Yuanji. A middleman. A man named Lu from the capital's chancellery. The mission: to render the province ungovernable, destroy the infrastructure, undermine confidence in the governor, do not kill the governor. Daniel noted that detail. Yuanji didn't want a direct assassination after the failure with Luo Han. He wanted the province to fall apart on its own. He wanted the governor to return to the capital in disgrace, or stay and rot away. Daniel sat down across from Jiang Mo. He said he had a proposal. Jiang Mo could continue working for Lu, send reports, regularly, in detail. Only the content of the reports would be coordinated with Daniel. Jiang Mo would write the truth, almost. That the province is poor, that the governor is a bit of an eccentric, that he's building some bridges and digging ditches. Nothing interesting, nothing dangerous, nothing worth paying attention to. In return, Jiang Mo would receive housing, food, and a job. A real one, not mercenary work. Jiang Mo asked what kind of job it was. Daniel replied that he needed an instructor, someone to teach the patrolmen the basics of night surveillance and hand-to-hand combat. Jiang Mo was silent for a long time. Then he asked why the administrator would trust a mercenary. Daniel replied that he didn't trust him. He was using him. The difference is that this use is honest. Both sides know the terms. No one is pretending to be a friend. Jiang Mo smirked. For the first time during the entire conversation, his expression changed. He said it was the most honest offer he'd received in 10 years of work. He agreed. Jessica was against it. She told Daniel so directly the very next day. She stood in front of him and said that a mercenary is always a mercenary, that his loyalty belongs to whoever pays the most, that one day he would betray them. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he said one sentence. He said that Jessica, too, had once served those who betrayed her, and that loyalty isn't a human trait, but a trait of the situation. Create the right situation, and loyalty will follow. Jessica fell silent. He saw her clench her teeth. The blow had landed squarely, and she knew it. She turned and walked away. That evening, she came back. She said he was right. She said she hated it when he was right. And she said that if Jiang Mo took a single wrong step, she would kill him before he could finish that step. Daniel nodded. He said that was exactly why Jessica was in charge of security, not him. She looked at him. A long look across the dimly lit room. Then she said quietly that in all her years of service, not a single commander had ever told her that she could disobey an order if she considered it dishonorable. She remembers that. She remembers it every day. Daniel said nothing. No words were needed. By the end of the second month, the province had begun to change. Not quickly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. The third pile-supported road connected the second and fourth villages. The fourth road was under construction. The floating farm stood firmly on its new anchors. The rice was growing. Slowly, but it was growing. Mei Lin harvested the first batch of marsh medicines for sale. Silverweed, water lily roots, and an extract from the shell of a marsh beetle that reduced inflammation. She laid everything out on the table in the tower. 12 varieties, each with a description, each with a dosage, each with indications and contraindications. Wenji compiled a catalog. 3 copies. Daniel looked at this small apothecary storeroom and thought, this cost money, real money. In the Empire, marsh medicines were a rarity. Apothecaries in the capital sold them by the weight of silver. But here they had the raw materials, for free, endless. If they could set up a supply line, but a supply line required a caravan, and a caravan required a trail leading out of the swamps. To make a trail, you need people who know the way to the mainland. Daniel unfolded the map. The provincial border lay to the west, where the porters had dropped him off. A 2-day journey. Across the swamp. The trail he'd come along. He remembered it. Every step. Every pothole. But he'd traveled it only once. In a single season. Now it was a different season. The rain had changed the waterways. The trail might have changed. He needed to walk it again, to update the map, to find a safe route for the cargo caravan. He took Gao Jian and Zhou Bai with him. The young soldier had changed over the past 2 months. He no longer viewed the fog as a grave. He viewed it as a challenge. Daniel had taught him to read the signs, the direction of the wind by the tilt of the reeds, depth by the color of the water, the presence of creatures by their sounds. Zhou Bai learned eagerly, like a man who had found something that made sense. They walked for 2 days. Daniel updated the map at every step. The trail had changed. 3 out of 10 sections had become impassable. New pits, shifting currents. One section that had once been a swamp had dried up and become a solid trail. The swamp was changing, just as Chen Hai had said. Daniel found detours. He marked them. He memorized them. The map was redrawn. They reached the provincial border on the 3rd day. The crooked post stood in its place. Beyond it began a regular dirt road. Dry, firm, imperial territory. Daniel stood by the post and looked at the road. A caravan was traveling along it. 3 wagons. Merchants. They drove past without even glancing toward the swamps. For them, Wanza didn't exist. A dead end. A grave. A blank spot on the imperial map. Daniel smiled. Soon they would look this way. Soon. The first caravan left Wanja at the beginning of the 3rd month. 3 porters. Each carried a box of medicines on his back, 12 varieties, a total weight of about 30 jin. By trade standards, it was nothing. By the standards of the marshy province, where there had never been any exports, it was everything. Daniel didn't go with the caravan. He stayed behind. Zhou Bai led the caravan. The young soldier knew the route. Daniel had walked it with him twice. Every turn, every dangerous spot. Zhou Bai repeated it aloud until he memorized it. Daniel gave him one more thing. A letter. Sealed. Addressed to an apothecary in the nearest town beyond the provincial border. The town was called Liushan. A 3-day journey from the border. Small, a trading town. The apothecary's name was Song Bo. Lianzhou's memory told him that Song Bo traded in marsh herbs. He bought them from hunters who risked venturing to the edge of Wanzi. He paid little. He sold them at a high price. The letter was simple. Daniel offered direct delivery, no middlemen. The price was half that of the middlemen. The quality was twice as high. Deliveries would be made once a month. He didn't ask for a reply, he asked for a meeting. Zhou Bai left. Daniel stood at the side of the road and watched as 3 figures disappeared into the fog. Then he turned and walked toward the western marshes, toward the muddy lord. He'd been thinking about it since the first week. A creature the locals feared with sacred dread. A giant amphibian. Daniel had been watching it from afar for a whole month. The map recorded every movement, every cycle, every stop. He knew more about the Lord than any living person. Body length about 8 paces. Approximate weight, a metric ton or more. 4 webbed limbs, a long, flat tail. Gray-green skin covered in silt. Small eyes, almost blind. Navigates by vibration and scent. Eats fish. A lot. Hunts at dawn. Sleeps during the day in a pit filled with warm water. Patrols the territory at night. Not aggressive. Not once during a month of observation did it attack anything other than fish. Territorial. Its route bypassed certain areas. It avoided places where small marsh predators nested. Not out of fear, out of indifference. He was too big to be bothered. Daniel got closer and closer with each passing day. 100 steps, 80, 60. He was studying its reaction. At 50 steps, the Lord raised his head. At 40, it would begin to turn. At 30, it would emit a low, vibrating sound. A warning, not a threat. Daniel never got closer than 30. He would stop. Sit down, wait. After 10 minutes, the Lord would lose interest and go back to what it was doing. A pattern. Clear. Predictable. The creature didn't want to fight. It wanted to be left alone. Daniel began bringing fish. Fresh fish. Every day. He left it 30 paces from the pit and walked away. By morning, the fish was gone. He left it 25 paces away. It would disappear. At 20 paces, it would disappear. After 2 weeks, he left the fish 15 paces away and didn't leave. He sat down on a mound and waited. The sun was setting. Fog crept across the ground. A head rose from the pit. Huge. Flat. Wet. Small eyes glinted in the twilight. Its mouth opened slightly. Daniel saw the teeth. Small. Blunt. The teeth of a fish eater, not a predator. The creature looked at the fish, then at Daniel, then back at the fish. Slowly. Very slowly. It crawled out of the hole. The ground trembled under its weight. It crept up to the fish, grabbed it, swallowed it in 2 gulps, then froze. Daniel didn't move. He wasn't breathing. The creature turned and crawled back into the pit. 15 steps. Contact established. He didn't know how long it would take to tame it, if taming it was even possible. This was no pet. It was a wild creature weighing a metric ton, with its own territory and its own rules. But Daniel had an advantage. He could read patterns. He could see the logic behind its behavior. And the logic suggested that the master was capable of getting used to a human's presence if the human posed no threat and brought food. Classic desensitization. In a past life, he'd seen how this worked with crocodiles in Myanmar. Local fishermen fed the large males, and they would leave the fishing grounds. Not friendship, a deal. Food in exchange for space. Daniel could offer the master the same deal. Fish in exchange for labor. If the creature could haul logs, it would replace 10 porters. If it could clear riverbeds, it would replace 20 diggers. If. Meanwhile, Zhou Bai returned 12 days later. He didn't come alone. Behind him walked a man in a traveling cloak with a sack slung over his shoulder. Sun Bo, the apothecary from Liushan. He had come in person. Daniel met him at the edge of the marshes. Song Bo was a short, stout man with quick eyes, a merchant to the core. He was assessing everything around him, the tower, the roads, the people. He sniffed the air and gauged distances. Daniel led him into the tower and showed him the supplies. 12 types of medicinal raw materials. Sunbo examined each one. He touched them. He sniffed them. He tasted them on his tongue. His face remained impassive, a professional mask. But Daniel saw his hands. When Sunbo picked up a bundle of water lily roots, his fingers trembled. These roots were worth their weight in silver, real silver. Alchemists in the capital bought them for potions they sold to aristocrats. Daniel named his price, half what they cost in the capital. Sunbo haggled. Daniel let him knock 10% off, no more. Sunbo agreed. He signed the contract that Wenji had drafted overnight, delivery once a month, payment in silver upon receipt, as much as possible. Sunbo left with the first shipment. Carried on the backs of his servants was merchandise worth more than all the taxes that Wanzi owed the empire over 10 years. Daniel stood on the road and watched him go. Mei Ling stood beside him. She asked how he felt. Daniel replied that he felt as if he had opened a gate. A small, narrow, but a gate, through which people could be led out of poverty. Mei Ling nodded. She said nothing more. She rarely said anything more. She simply stood beside him. That was enough. By the end of the third month, Daniel realized he needed people he didn't have. Construction was underway. 4 of the 7 roads were finished. The 5th was under construction. The farm was yielding its first harvest. Trade with Sunbo was going well. Silver was coming in every month, not much, but it was coming in. The problem lay elsewhere. Daniel was doing everything himself. Every map, every calculation, every layout, every decision about where to drive a pile and where to dig a ditch. 412 people depended on a single mind, his mind. And that mind was starting to tire. The map in his brain had grown. 15 in every direction, thousands of points, currents, nests, trails, water levels at 6 stations over 3 months, seasonal changes, layers upon layers. After every major survey, he'd sleep for 10 hours and wake up with a dull ache behind his eyes. Sometimes he'd mix up names. He called Gao Jian Chen Hai. He called Wenji Mei Ling. Mei Ling was the first to notice. She approached him that evening and said he looked paler than usual, that his hands were cold even after a hot herbal tea, that he'd repeated the same sentence twice in one day without realizing it. Daniel wanted to brush it off, but he looked at her and changed his mind. She was an herbalist. She saw the illness before the patient did. He told her the truth. Not the whole truth. Not about the other world. Not about Daniel Shaw. But about the map in his head. He said that his ability to see the swamp came at a price. The larger the map, the however it was to hold on to it. Mei Lin listened in silence. She wasn't surprised. She said that every gift comes with a price, and that she'd seen something similar among shamans in distant villages. They saw spirits but lost sleep and memory in exchange. She said she would help. She began preparing a decoction for him every morning, bitter, made from roots she wouldn't name. Daniel drank it and felt the fog in his head lift slightly. Not a cure, just support. But the main problem remained. He needed specialists, people who could take on parts of the work. A cartographer who would transfer his maps to paper and update them without him. An engineer who would calculate the next roads and bridges. An alchemist who would understand the properties of materials from the marshes and find new uses for them. A diplomat who would handle affairs with the outside world. There were no such people in the villages. The villages provided him with fishermen, builders, and hunters, wonderful people, strong people, but not the kind of people he needed. Those people were in the empire, in the cities, in the capital, and they weren't there because they wanted to be. Many were there simply because they had nowhere else to go. Daniel began to ask around, cautiously, through Sunbo, through the merchants who came to the border, through rumors. He asked about people who had no place to go, the disgraced, the exiled, the fugitives, those whom the system had spat out and forgotten. Sunbo was a merchant, and merchants know everything. He brought the first names a month later. 3 names, 3 stories. The first, Han So-yun, 20 years old, the daughter of a Korean ambassador who died in the capital under unexplained circumstances. After her father's death, she was sold into service to a minor prince in the south. She ran away. She walked through 3 provinces. They were looking for her. Not very hard. A runaway servant isn't worth much effort. But they didn't give up either.
She came to Wanja because no one goes there. She lived on the edge of the marshes, alone. She ate whatever she could find. She survived on the knowledge her father had given her. Languages, etiquette, diplomacy, history, and law. All useless for surviving in the swamps, yet all invaluable for what Daniel was building. The second, Olivia Reed. Her real name was Li Yue, 25 years old, the daughter of an executed alchemist. Her father created inexpensive medicines for the common people. The capital's Alchemists Guild accused him of undermining their monopoly and of heresy. He was publicly executed. His daughter went into hiding. She spent 5 years on the run, moving from city to city and changing her name. She worked underground, selling medicines on the black market. She was known in certain circles. Brilliant, unpredictable, a threat to anyone who controls the potion market. Third, Emily Carter. Real name, Ka Mei Li, 22 years old. The daughter of a merchant who disappeared on an expedition to the east. A self-taught cartographer. She followed in her father's footsteps, from city to city. She drew maps. She sold them for food. She made it to the Wanj border and stopped. She stood by a post and looked out at the fog. She came every day. She stood there every day. She couldn't bring herself to go inside. Daniel read these stories and set the paper down on the table. 3 women, 3 sets of skills, 3 reasons why they had nowhere to go, 3 reasons why they did have somewhere to go. He started with So-yeon, because she was the closest. He found her on the second day of his search. She lived in a hole at the edge of the marshes. Literally in a hole. Dug into the slope of a mound. Covered with branches. When Daniel approached, she was standing at the entrance with a sharpened stick in her hands. Thin. Dirty. Eyes wild. Ready to fight. Daniel stopped 10 paces away. He told her who he was. He said he needed someone who knew how to communicate with the world outside the swamp. He said he was offering a job. A real one. With a roof over her head, food, and a purpose. So-yeon didn't lower her stick. She asked what he wanted in return. Her voice was hoarse. She hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. Daniel replied that he wanted her to read other people's letters and write her own. That he wanted her to explain to him who was who at court and in the neighboring provinces. That he wanted her to be his voice to those who wouldn't come to the swamp. So-yeon looked at him. The stick slowly dropped. She asked why he trusted her. He replied that he didn't trust her. He was giving her a chance to earn his trust. There was a significant difference. So-yeon smiled. Her first smile in months. She said she'd go with him. But if he betrayed her, she'd stab him in the leg with that stick. Daniel replied that he accepted the terms. They returned to the tower. Wen-ji saw So-yeon and gasped. She was dirty and thin, but even in that state it was evident. Her posture, the way she held her head, the way she moved her hands. An aristocrat. Right down to her fingertips. Mei Ling had washed her, fed her, given her clothes. So-yeon ate so quickly that she choked and coughed. Mei Ling silently handed her some water. No comments. No pity. She simply handed it to her. So-yeon looked at her, and something in her face broke. Not a cry. Not a scream. Something internal. A wall that had stood for a long time. It cracked. The next day, So-yeon washed up again. She tied her hair back. She straightened her back. She walked over to the table where a map and a stack of records. She read for 3 hours. Then she approached Daniel. She told him that his trading contract with Sung-bo was poorly drafted. 3 clauses work against him. The price is tied to volume, not quality. This means that Sung-bo will demand more volume and pay less for rare varieties. Penalties for failed deliveries are specified for only one party, his party. And most importantly, there's no exclusivity clause. Sun-bo could bring in a competitor tomorrow and pit them against each other. Daniel listened, and with every word, his respect for her grew. She was right, on all 3 points. He hadn't been a trader in his previous life. He'd been an analyst. He understood the terrain. But the market was a different terrain, and he needed a guide. He told So-yeon that he was giving her the authority to rewrite the contract. She looked at him, expecting a catch, expecting conditions, expecting him to say he'd only sign after reviewing it. He said he'd sign without even looking at it. So-yeon froze. She stood motionless for a full minute. Then she turned and walked to the corner of the tower, where Wen-ji had set aside a space for her. She shut herself away there for 2 days. She wrote. She rewrote. She edited. When she came out, she was holding the document that Daniel had indeed signed without even looking at it. So-yeon watched as he affixed his seal, and her lips trembled. She turned away quickly. But Mei-ling saw it, and Mei-ling understood. He hadn't found Olivia on his own. She had found him. On the 5th day after So-yeon's arrival at the Wanja border, a boy showed up, about 12 years old, dirty, out of breath. He'd been running for 2 days from Liushan. He was carrying a note. The note was from Songbo. It was short. It said that a woman had appeared in town who was looking for a province where marsh herbs were bought. She was questioning the merchants. She was showing samples of potions that Sunbo had never seen before. She was dangerous. Or useful. Sunbo hadn't made up his mind. Daniel read the note and understood. Li Yue. Olivia. She had heard about the trade and was drawn by the scent of raw materials, just as a scientist is drawn by the scent of a laboratory. He didn't wait. He took Joe by and headed for the border. It was a 2-day journey. At the border, he left Joe by behind and set out alone onto the Imperial Road. It was 3 days to Liushan. He walked quickly. Lianzhou's body carried him effortlessly, a scout accustomed to long marches. He arrived in Liushan on the evening of the 2nd day. A small town. A market. 3 streets. A wall of adobe bricks. A garrison of 20 soldiers who mostly drank and played dice. Daniel found Songbo in his shop. The apothecary was sitting behind the counter, sorting through dried roots. He saw Daniel and raised an eyebrow. He hadn't expected the manager to come in person. Daniel asked where the woman was. Sunbo said she was staying at the inn on South Street, a room on the 2nd floor. She doesn't go out during the day. She works at night. The neighbors complain about the smell. Daniel went to the hotel. He went up to the 2nd floor. He could smell it even on the stairs. Sour, bitter, chemical. The smell of alchemical work. He knocked on the door. Silence. Then a rustle. Then a voice. Quick, nervous. The voice asked who was there. Daniel identified himself. The governor of Wanja province. Silence. A long one. Then the door opened. Olivia was small, thin, with dark circles under her eyes and fingers stained with something yellow. Her hair was tied back in a bun, with strands escaping in all directions. Behind her, the room looked like an explosion had gone off in a pharmacy. Test tubes, mortars, powders, dried plants hung on the walls. On the table, something was bubbling in a clay vessel over a small alcohol burner. She looked up at him. Her eyes were quick, appraising, distrustful. She asked what he needed. Daniel replied that he needed an alchemist. She asked why. He replied that he had a swamp full of raw materials found nowhere else in the empire, and he needed someone who could turn those materials into things people would pay for. She narrowed her eyes. She asked what kind of raw materials. Daniel began to list them. Silverweed, water lily roots, swamp beetle shells, luminous resin from trees in the mist zone, slime from muddy amphibians, pollen from nocturnal waterflowers. With each name, Olivia's eyes grew wider. She cut him off at the 6th item. She said that the glowing resin was the basis for regenerative ointments that the Capital's Guild sold for the price of gold. She said that the amphibian slime contained ingredients her father had used in his cheap medicines, and for which he'd been executed. She said that if he really had all of this, she was willing to work for free for the rest of her life. Daniel said he didn't need her to work for free. He needed food, a roof over her head, and a lab. Olivia laughed. A short, sharp laugh. Like a bark. She said she had no choice, to be honest. She was out of money. The guild had sent people searching for her across 3 provinces. Another week and they'd find her. Daniel said they wouldn't find her in Wanja. She looked at him. Then she began packing her things. She packed for 40 minutes. She wrapped each vial in a rag. She transferred every powder into a sturdy little bag. She packed each tool as if it were a child. Daniel helped in silence. They left the inn at night. Olivia was carrying a bag on her back that weighed more than she did. Daniel offered to help. She refused. She said that this was all that remained of her father, his tools, his notes, his recipes. She would carry them herself. They walked for 2 days to the border. Olivia talked non-stop. She described the properties of every plant she saw by the roadside. She asked questions about the swamp that Daniel didn't always understand. She used terms that weren't in the Lianzhou lexicon, and that Daniel recognized only because he had read scientific journals in his past life. She spoke quickly, jumping from one topic to topic. She'd forget what she'd started to say and begin anew. Daniel listened, and with every passing hour, he realized he'd found more than just an alchemist. He'd found a mind that operated at a speed his world had never encountered before. They entered Wanja on the 3rd day. Olivia saw the swamp and stopped. She stood at the edge of the mist and breathed, deeply, like someone who had come home. She said quietly that it smelled right. Daniel didn't understand. She explained that all alchemical ingredients have a scent, and that this mist smelled like her father's laboratory, like home. They reached the tower. Mei Lin greeted Olivia warily. 2 women who work with plants and medicines. Territory. Daniel saw that. Olivia didn't. She immediately grabbed a bundle of silverweed from the shelf and began sniffing it, breaking it apart and rubbing it between her fingers. She muttered numbers and names. Mei Lin stood and watched. Then Olivia turned to her and asked how she stored water lily roots. Mei Lin replied, "In a dry place, in bundles." Olivia shook her head. She said that the roots lose 70% of their properties when dried. They need to be stored in water, cold water, with a specific kind of salt added. Mei Lin frowned. Then she asked what kind of salt. Olivia explained, in detail, including the recipe. Mei Lin listened. Her expression slowly changed. Her wariness faded. Something else took its place. A hunger. A hunger for knowledge she couldn't gain in the village. A hunger for conversation as equals. By evening, the 2 of them were sitting at a table piled high with plants, talking so fast that Wenji couldn't keep up with taking notes. Daniel stood to the side and watched. 2 people had found each other. He hadn't brought them together. He'd simply put them side by side. Their work did the rest. So Yan watched from her corner. She walked over to Daniel and said quietly that he was gathering people the way others gathered an army. Only his weapons weren't swords, but skills. Daniel replied that swords break, skills don't. So Yan snorted. She said it sounded nice, but in reality, people with skills are the first to be killed, because they're dangerous. Daniel looked at her. He said that was exactly why he had Jessica. So Yan raised an eyebrow and smiled for the first time ever. Not a smirk, a smile. A quick one, a genuine one. She said that maybe he wasn't as much of a fool as he seemed. Maybe. A week later, Emily arrived. Or rather, she didn't come. She was standing by the post at the border, drawing it. Zhou Bai found her during his patrol. A young woman with a sketch pad made of thin wooden slats. She was drawing the post. In detail. With shadows. With cracks in the wood. With every letter of the inscription. He brought her to Daniel. Emily was short, round-faced, with lively eyes that looked at everything as if seeing it for the first time. She asked if it was true that he was the provincial governor. Daniel confirmed it. She asked if it was true that he drew maps of the swamps. Daniel confirmed it. She asked if she could take a look. Daniel led her to the tower and showed her the map on the wall. Emily stood in front of it for 10 minutes without moving. Then she took out her tablet and began to copy it. Quickly, precisely. Her hand moved as if it had a life of its own. The lines fell perfectly straight. Depths, elevations, symbols. She was copying the map and improving it at the same time. She added a scale grid that Daniel didn't have. She added terrain features. She added current arrows with line thickness proportional to speed. Daniel watched her and felt something unfamiliar. He felt that whoever was seeing the same thing he was. Not the way he did. Not through an ability, through eyes and hands. But seeing. The map. The territory. The world as a system of lines and connections.
Emily finished the copy and turned to him. She asked who had drawn the original. Daniel replied that he had dictated it and Wen Ji had recorded it. Emily shook her head. She said the map was accurate but hard to read. Too much information on a single sheet. It needs to be broken down into layers. One sheet for depths, one for currents, one for trails, one for nests. Each layer is transparent. Overlay them on top of each other and you'll see the full picture. Remove one and you'll see only what you need. Daniel froze. Layers. She had described the principle of a GIS, a Geographic Information System.
The foundation of his work in his past life. She'd figured this out on her own, without a computer, without an education, through a cartographer's intuition. He asked why she'd come to Wanja. Emily fell silent. Her expression changed. The liveliness faded. Only a shadow remained. She said her father had left on an expedition to the east 3 years ago and never returned. She was looking for him, or what was left of him. She said she knew he was dead, but she couldn't stop. Not until she found him. Not until she saw him. Not until she knew exactly where. Daniel nodded. He understood. A blank spot on the map. The most painful of them all. The one you can't fill in until you get there and see it with your own eyes. He said he'd help her search. But for that, she needed to stay. To work. To draw maps. Every day his scouts ventured deeper and deeper eastward. Sooner or later they'd find a trail. Emily looked at him. She nodded. She stayed. By the end of the 3rd month, the tower had changed. Downstairs, Maylin and Olivia had turned a corner into a lab. The test tubes bubbled around the clock. Olivia worked through the night and fell asleep at her desk. Maylin would come in the morning and cover her with a blanket.
On the 2nd floor, Emily had hung 4 layers of maps, transparent ones, drawn on thin, oiled fabric. Depths, currents, trails, fauna. When Daniel returned from his rounds, he would dictate updates to her. She would transfer them to the appropriate layer. Quickly, precisely, without question. So-yeon took a desk in the corner. She wrote letters, commercial proposals, minutes, contracts. Her handwriting was impeccable. Her phrasing was sharper than Lohan's knife. 4 women, 4 walls surrounding a province that was beginning to breathe. Daniel stood in the doorway of the tower and looked out at the fog. He was smiling. For the first time in 3 months, it wasn't a dry, sarcastic smile. It came from something greater. And deep beneath his feet, beneath the water, beneath the mud, beneath the rock. Something was smiling along with him. The 4th month began when the muddy lord took a fish from Daniel's hands for the first time. Not from hand to mouth. Daniel placed the fish in his palm and held out his hand. The lord crawled forward. 5 steps. 3, 2. Daniel felt the earth vibrate beneath his feet. He felt the warmth of a body the size of a boat. He smelled the mud and wet skin. The enormous head tilted. Its mouth opened. Soft lips touched his palm. The fish vanished. The creature didn't leave. It stood 2 steps away, staring with its small eyes. Then it made a low sound. Not a warning. Something else. A vibration traveled through the ground, through Daniel's legs, and up his spine, settling somewhere at the back of his head. The map in his mind responded. It flinched, as if it had received new data. Not from his eyes. Not from his ears. From somewhere else. For a second, Daniel saw the swamp through the master's eyes. He didn't see it. He felt it. The vibrations, the temperature, the pressure of the water, the movement of all living things within a radius of 100 steps. A world without color or form. A world of waves. A moment. Then it was gone. The master turned and crawled back into the pit. Daniel stood there trembling. Not from fear, from understanding. His ability didn't just read the terrain. It could connect with the creatures that lived in that terrain. The map wasn't just his. The map belonged to everyone. He returned to the tower and said nothing to anyone. It was too early until he understood it himself. Starting the next day, he began coming to the master with a rope, a thick one, a sturdy one. He would tie the fish to the rope and leave it there. The master ate the fish along with the rope. Then Daniel began tying the fish to a log, a small one. The master would grab the fish and drag the log along. Then he'd let go. Then Daniel began tying the fish to a log with a long rope.
The master dragged the fish and pulled the log behind him. 10 steps, 20, 50. Fishermen from the village of Chenhaya stood on the road and watched as a giant amphibian dragged the log through the swamp. In full. With their mouths agape. One of them sat down on the boardwalk and said that the manager was definitely a magician. Another replied that magicians don't smell like fish from morning till night. Daniel smelled like fish all the time now. Mei Ling brought him soap made from swamp fat, and he washed every evening, but the smell wouldn't go away. So-yeon said he smelled like the fish market in Busan, and that if he was going to meet with the envoys, he needed to resolve this issue. Olivia said that the smell of fish was the smell of progress, and that she, personally, had gotten used to it. Emily drew the master. Every day. From different angles. She filled an entire sketchbook with drawings of a giant amphibian and labeled each one with the precision of a naturalist. Dimensions, behavior, time of day. By the middle of the 4th month, the master was hauling logs on command. Not by voice, by vibration. Daniel had learned to make a low, humming sound by pressing his palm to the ground. 3 short taps meant, come here. 1 long tap meant, stay. 2 short taps meant food. The master responded. Not always, not perfectly, but he responded. 10 logs a day. Work that would take 20 people a week. Road construction had tripled in speed. The 5th road was completed. The 6th was under construction. The village of Pengwei remained without a road, just as Daniel had promised. Pengwei came to the tower once a week. He sat. He watched. He remained silent. He left. He saw how other villages were connected, how children ran along the boardwalks, how caravans set off for the border and returned with silver. His village stood apart, isolated, just as before. Just as always. In the 3rd week of the 4th month, Pengwei did not come alone. With him were 7 men from his village. They brought alder logs, 3 dozen of them, cut and hewn, ready to use. Pengwei placed the logs by the entrance to the tower and looked at Daniel. He said nothing. He didn't apologize. He didn't admit he was wrong. He simply brought the logs. Daniel looked at the logs, then at Pengwei. He nodded. He said the layout would be ready tomorrow. Pengwei nodded in response and left. Chen Hai stood nearby, shaking his head. He said he never thought he'd live to see this day. Daniel replied that building roads is easier than building trust, but one leads to the other. At the end of the 4th month, a 2nd letter arrived from Yuanji. It was long, flowery, full of brotherly love and concern. Between the lines, something else could be read. Yuanji knew the province was developing. His spies were silent, but the silence of spies is also information. The saboteur hadn't returned. Luo Han hadn't returned. The wine hadn't worked. The knife hadn't worked. The piles hadn't collapsed. Yuanji was changing his approach. In the letter, he reported that he had submitted a petition to the capital requesting an imperial inspection of Wanzhou province. He wrote that this was for his younger brother's benefit, that the inspection would confirm his successes and strengthen his position at court. Daniel read the letter and handed it to So-yeon. She read it slowly. Then she looked up. Her eyes were cold. She said that an inspection was not an audit. It was preparation for a takeover. The inspector will arrive and see that the province is thriving. He'll write a report. The report will go to the court. The court will decide that the province is too valuable for a son of a concubine with no connections. The court will appoint a new governor, from the Shen family, or from a family allied with the Shen. Daniel will lose everything. Legally, cleanly, without bloodshed. Daniel sat in silence. Then he asked So-yeon how much time they had. So-yeon replied that the inspection wouldn't take place for at least 2 months. Bureaucracy, approvals, travel. 2 months. Daniel stood up. He said that in 2 months, the inspector would have to see a province that couldn't be handed over to anyone else. Not because it was valuable, but because it only worked as long as its creator was working. So-yeon raised an eyebrow. She asked how. Daniel replied that he'd show her. 2 months until the inspection. Daniel worked 18 hours a day. Mei Ling said he'd kill himself. He replied that he didn't have time for that. The first thing he did was build a signaling system. 5 towers. Not made of stone, wooden ones. Alder posts with platforms 3 human heights above the ground. On each platform, a brazier for smoke signals and a bell.
Jiang Mo turned out to be unexpectedly helpful. In the reconnaissance corps, he had worked with signaling systems. He knew the codes. He knew how to create a signal chart. 3 colors of smoke, white, green, and black. Combinations of 1, 2, or 3 plumes of smoke. The number of bell strikes. A simple system that allowed for the transmission of 26 different messages. Danger in the east. Danger in the west. The water is rising. The water is receding. A creature has been spotted. A caravan is approaching. Help is needed. Fire. The 26 messages covered every situation Daniel could foresee. He trained the lookouts, 10 men, 2 for each tower, shifts every 8 hours. Within a week, the system was up and running. A message from the farthest tower reached the central tower in 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Previously, a messenger had needed half a day. The second thing he did was expand the farm. 1 platform couldn't feed 400 people. 5 were needed. He built 4 in a month. Mei Lin found a way to speed up the growth of water rice. Olivia prepared fertilizer from marsh silt, ash, and some powders that she mixed at night, muttering to herself. The fertilizer worked. The rice grew twice as fast. The seedlings sprouted in 2 weeks instead of the usual month. Emily drew a diagram for the farm's layout. 5 platforms positioned so that the current would naturally carry nutrients to them. She calculated this herself, using current maps. Daniel checked it. The calculation was correct. Third, he began keeping records, proper ones. So-Yun compiled a population registry. Every village, every family, number of people, age, skills, property, supplies. So-Yun compiled a resource registry. What was available? What was needed? What was produced? What was consumed? What was exported? She drew up a budget, the first budget in the history of Wanja province. Silver from trade with Songbo, expenses for tools and materials. The balance. Small, but positive. The province was earning more than it was spending, for the first time. So-Yun said that these documents were more important than roads. An inspector might not appreciate the pilings, but he would appreciate the numbers. If the numbers showed that the province was profitable and growing, it would be politically difficult to take it away from the current governor. Not impossible, but difficult. Fourth, Daniel ventured deeper into the swamp than ever before. He took Gao Jian, Zhou Bai, and Jessica and headed east, to where the map ended in white. For 3 days, they traveled through territory that no human had seen in decades. The map in Daniel's mind expanded with every step. B. The swamp was changing. It was getting deeper. The fog was thicker. The trees were taller and darker. The sounds were different, not swamp sounds, but sounds from the depths. Low vibrations felt not with the ears but with the bones. On the second day, they found ruins, stone walls protruding from the water, overgrown with moss and vines, the foundation of something large. Daniel stood knee-deep in the water and looked at the stones. They were worked, smooth, carved, with patterns he didn't recognize. Not impalpable, not of the steppes, not of the mountains, something else, something older. Emily was sketching the patterns on her tablet. Her hand trembled with excitement. She said she'd never seen a style like this before. It didn't resemble any known culture. Daniel placed his palm on a stone, and the map in his mind exploded. It didn't hurt. It wasn't loud. It was as if a door that had been locked had opened. He saw it. For a second. For a fleeting moment. A city. Huge. Made of stone. Standing on stilts in the middle of a swamp. Thousands of houses. Dozens of towers. Canals instead of streets. And people. Lots of people. But not quite people. Something different in their eyes. Something they all had in common. As if they were all looking through the same pair of eyes. Then the vision faded. Daniel stood in the water, trembling. Gao Jian grabbed him by the shoulder. He asked what had happened. Daniel replied that he needed to sit down. He sat down on a rock and caught his breath. Jessica stood nearby, a sword in her hand. She was staring into the fog. The fog was moving. Not like usual, purposefully. Toward them. As if something were watching from within. Daniel raised his hand and said they were leaving. Right now. Quickly, they left. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen. It was too soon. But he knew. Beneath the swamp lay a dead city. And the city wasn't dead. It was sleeping. And it was beginning to wake up. Because Daniel had touched its wall. Because Daniel was the one it had been waiting for. They returned to the tower 2 days later. Daniel slept for 14 hours. When he woke up, the map in his head was different. Larger. Deeper. With a new layer that hadn't been there before. Underground. Beneath the swamp were voids, channels, chambers, an entire network, like the roots of a tree, or like a nervous system. He hadn't seen it before because he hadn't touched the stone. Now he could sense it, faintly, like a distant murmur. But he could sense it, and this murmur wasn't chaotic. It was rhythmic, like breathing. The inspector arrived at the beginning of the 6th month. His name was Zhang Peilin, a 4th-rank official, from the capital, well-groomed, with 2 secretaries and a security detail of 10 soldiers. They walked out to the border of Wanzi and stopped. Zhang Peilin looked at the signpost and at the fog beyond it, and his face expressed what everyone who saw it for the first time felt: revulsion and fear. Daniel met him in person. He stood at the edge of the swamp in clean clothes that So Yun had made him wear. So Yun stood 2 steps behind him, flawless, upright, with a hairstyle that told the initiated that she was not a swamp peasant but an aristocrat by birth. Zhang Peilin saw her, and his eyes narrowed. He recognized the type. He didn't recognize her personally, but he recognized her class. That was the first seed of doubt. Daniel bowed according to the protocol that So Yun had drilled into him for 3 days. The depth of the bow, the angle of the head, the position of the hands. Every gesture mattered. Every gesture told the inspector that the manager knew the rules, that he wasn't a savage, that he wasn't crazy, that he was someone to be reckoned with. Daniel led the inspector along the pile-supported road. Zhang Peilin walked, and his expression changed. The road was smooth, dry, sturdy. The railings were solid. The decking didn't creak. This wasn't a makeshift structure. This was infrastructure. They passed through the first village. Chen Hai met them, in clean clothes, with a bow. The village was different. In 6 months, the piles had been reinforced. The houses had been straightened. The ditch was functioning. Water was flowing. The smell of rot had disappeared. Children were playing on the decking. Clean, clothed, well-fed. Zhang Peilin counted the houses. He counted the people. He counted the children. His secretaries took notes. Daniel led him to the farms. 5 floating platforms. Green with rice seedlings. The inspector stopped. He asked what they were. Daniel explained. Floating farms. Paddy rice. 2 harvests a year instead of 1. Zhang Peilin turned to his secretary and whispered something. The secretary took notes. Then the tower. A map on the wall. Emily's 4 lairs. So Yun's ledgers. Mei Ling and Olivia's drug catalog. Trade agreements. The budget. The numbers. Zhang Peilin read the documents for 2 hours. In silence. His secretaries made copies. When he finished, he looked up at Daniel. He said that in 30 years of service, he had seen hundreds of provinces. He had never seen one that could build a functioning economy from scratch in 6 months. Daniel bowed his head. He said nothing. The documents were meant to speak for themselves. So Yun interjected, gently, precisely. She handed the inspector the final document, a list of tax revenues. For the first time in its history, Wanzi province was ready to pay a tax to the imperial treasury, a small, symbolic amount, but a tax nonetheless. Not arrears, not a debt. Revenue. Zhang Peilin read it. His eyebrows rose. He placed the document on the table and looked at So Yun, then at Daniel. He said he would write a report. He said the report would be objective. He did not say whose side he would take. But Daniel saw his eyes. There was no hostility in them. There was surprise. Genuine surprise. The inspector stayed for 3 days. He walked along the roads. He visited villages. He talked to people. He saw the master on the 2nd day. A giant amphibian was dragging a bundle of logs past the road. Zhang Peilin stood on the deck and watched. His face turned pale. Then it flushed.
Then he turned to Daniel and asked how. Daniel replied, "With fish. Lots of fish and patience." On the third day, the inspector left. He shook Daniel's hand, a formal gesture, but added a nod to it. A small one. Personal. Not by the book. Seyeon stood nearby, and when the inspector was out of sight, she exhaled. A long breath. She said they'd bought themselves some time. Not the war. Time. The report would be positive. The court wouldn't be able to simply take the province. Yuanji would have to find another way. Daniel nodded. He knew Yuanji would find a way. It was only a matter of time. But now they had time too. And he knew how to use time. That night, he heard the voice for the first time. Not in a dream, in reality. He was sitting on the second floor of the tower looking at a map. It was late. Everyone was asleep. The fog outside the window hung like a thick wall, and in the silence he heard it. Not a word, not a sound, a sensation, as if someone had placed a warm hand on the back of his head and gently guided his gaze eastward, toward the ruins, toward the stone and the patterns and the vision of a dead city. The sensation was clear. "Go, I'll show you." Daniel sat motionless. His heart beat steadily. He wasn't afraid. He realized he hadn't been afraid from the very beginning. Whatever lay beneath the marshes didn't want to harm him. It wanted to be seen. Just as the marsh wanted to be read. Just as the villages wanted to be connected. Just as people wanted to be noticed. It was all the same need. "See me," he whispered into the empty room. "Soon. I'll come." The sensation faded. Only a warmth remained at the back of his neck. He went to sleep. In the morning, he didn't mix up a single name. The punitive force arrived 2 months after the inspector's departure. Yuanji did not wait for the court's decision. He acted through General Li Hongmin, an old military man who owed the Shen family 3 large loans. The general brought 12,000 men, 3 columns, from the west, the northwest, and the southwest. They entered Wanja at dawn. Daniel found out about it 8 hours later. The signal towers worked flawlessly. White smoke from the western tower. 3 columns. A large force. Heading west. A minute later, confirmation from the northwest tower. 2 directions. 3 minutes later, the south tower. 3 directions. Daniel stood on the central tower and watched the smoke. 12,000. Soyeon stood beside him. She said that Yuanji had finally decided not to play games. Daniel replied that 12,000 people in a swamp aren't an army. They're 12,000 people who need water, food, and a trail. They have none of those things. He has all 3. He went down to the tower. He gathered the people. Jessica, Gao Jian, Zhou Bai, Jiang Mo, Luo Han, Chen Hai, Peng Wei. 20 senior sentries. He spoke for 10 minutes. Calmly, clearly, without a single word of panic or fear. He said that the army would advance along the trails marked with imperial symbols. He said that there were no imperial symbols left in Wanja. All the original posts and markers had rotted away decades ago. But over the past month, Jessica and Jiang Mo had put up new ones. On his instructions. 86 posts bearing imperial symbols. 86 signposts all pointing in the same direction. Toward the central lowland, the deepest part of the marshes, surrounded on 3 sides by quagmire and on the 4th by the territory of the Muddy Lord. And his 2 kin, whom Daniel discovered in the 4th month. 3 giant amphibians, each the size of a boat. The army will follow the signposts because there are no other landmarks. The army will reach the lowland because the lowland looks like a passable valley with a flat bottom and gentle banks. The army will set up camp because the soldiers will be exhausted after 3 days of marching through the swamp. And then, Daniel fell silent. Everyone looked at him. He said that no one would die. He repeated it. No one. Not a single soldier. Not a single one of his men. Not a single creature. He said the army would leave on its own. Because he would take away the only thing it needed. Water. All the sources of clean water in the central lowland were temporary. They depended on an underground current that Daniel could redirect. Not with magic, physics.
3 dams made of stones and logs at key points along the underground channel. Mei Lin had calculated the fog cycles. She said that in 3 days, a dense period would begin. The fog would rise and last for 4 days. Visibility would drop to 3 steps. The army would be blinded. The troops advanced. They followed the signposts. 3 days. Daniel monitored the situation via the signal towers. Every 2 hours, lookouts relayed the column's positions. Smoke. A bell. 26 messages were enough. The western column arrived first. It stopped in a low-lying area. It set up camp. The northern column arrived half a day later. The southern column arrived by evening. 12,000 men in a single valley. General Li Hongming pitched his tent on a hill and sent scouts to find the road to the central settlements. The scouts did not return. Not because they had been killed. It was because they'd gotten lost. The signposts led them in circles. Each post pointed to the next to the next. The circle closed 5 li from the camp. The scouts walked in circles for 6 hours and returned to the general's tent dirty and angry. On the second day, Daniel dammed up the water. 3 dams. Luo Han, Jiang Mo, and 10 volunteers from the patrols built them overnight. The underground current was diverted. The streams in the lowlands dried up. The wells the soldiers dug yielded salt water. Swamp salt, undrinkable. On the third day, fog rolled in. Thick, white, impenetrable. Mei Ling had calculated it perfectly. The army was blinded. The soldiers huddled around the campfires. The fires died down from the dampness. The horses grew restless. The supply wagons were stuck. And in the fog, shadows began to move. Large, slow. The 3 muddy lords. They did not attack. They walked in circles. Heavy, enormous. The ground trembled beneath them. The soldiers heard footsteps and wheezing and splashing, but could see nothing. Panic began to grow. Not quickly, slowly, like water in a swamp. On the 4th day, the army ran out of water. General Li Hongming sat in his tent and stared at a map that showed nothing. His officers stood around him, silent. 12,000 men, and not a single one knew which way was north. The tent flap swung open. A man entered, alone, unarmed, in plain clothes. He smelled of fish. Daniel sat down across from the general. He set a teapot on the table, the very same one from which Sun He drank every morning. She had appeared 3 weeks ago, quietly, as always. But this wasn't about her now. Daniel poured the tea. The general looked at him. An old soldier, 60 years old, 3 wars. He'd seen a lot, but he'd never seen a man who'd walked through an army of 12,000 as if through an empty room. Daniel spoke up.
He said he wouldn't kill anyone.
He said he'd let everyone go. But first, they would write a joint report to the emperor. The report would state that the punitive corps had arrived in Wanja province and found that the province was loyal to the crown, paid its taxes, and did not require a military presence. The report would be signed by the general and the governor, and Daniel would tell the general the truth, the whole truth, about the province, about trade, about the people, about the swamp, about what's being built here. He said that the general had 30 years of service left, and that over those 30 years, he would find it useful to have one honest ally in a place that no one knows anything about. The general was silent. He looked at the teapot, then at Daniel. Then he picked up the cup and drank. The tea was hot, clear, delicious. The first clean water in 2 days. Behind the tent, in the fog, something sighed. Deeply, slowly. The ground trembled slightly. The general looked toward the sound, then back at Daniel. He asked what it was. Daniel replied that it was the swamp. It was breathing. The general poured himself some more tea. He began to listen.
The army left 2 days later.
Daniel personally led the first column to the western border. He walked ahead, and the soldiers followed him. Thousands of boots on the causeway his men had built in a single night. Temporary, unreliable, but enough for 12,000 men to leave the swamp alive. Not a single death, not a single casualty, not a single missing person. General Li Hongming was the last to leave. He sat on his horse by the border post and gazed at the fog. He signed the report.
Every word. Wanjia province is loyal to the crown. Governor Shen Lianzhou is fulfilling his duty. Military intervention is not required. The general looked at Daniel standing on the other side of the post. He said that in his 60 years of life, he had been defeated 3 times, twice by the sword, once by a teapot. He said that the third defeat was the most honorable. Daniel bowed. The general turned his horse around and rode off. The dust from his column settled on the road. Daniel stood and watched. Then he turned toward the swamp. It was time. He had been preparing for this for a month, ever since the day he first heard the call in reality. He knew that sooner or later he would have to go. Eastward, to the ruins, to the stone, to whatever was waiting. He left at dawn the next day. He took Sun He with him. She was waiting at the entrance to the tower when he came out. She stood in dry white clothes in the midst of a wet world. As always. She looked at him, and he saw in her eyes that she knew where they were going. She had always known. He didn't ask. They set off. Mei Lin stepped out onto the threshold and watched them go. She didn't stop him. She handed him a small bag of herbal tea and told him to drink it every 4 hours. So-yeon stood by the second-floor window. She didn't come out. She pressed her palm against the glass, a gesture Daniel didn't see but that Mei Lin did. Olivia was asleep at the table, her face buried in the blueprints. She'd been working all night. A note lay beneath her hand. She'd written it for Daniel in case he left while she was asleep. The note contained a single sentence. "Come back because I'm not done yet." Emily was standing on the road with a sketch pad. She was drawing a map for Daniel, the last section of the eastern swamp they'd traversed together. She handed him the sheet and said that the blank spots beyond that edge were now his responsibility. Daniel took the map. He looked at Emily. She was smiling, but her eyes were wet. Jessica emerged from the fog. Silently. As always. She handed him a small knife in a leather sheath. He looked at the knife. Then at her. She said the knife was useless against what awaited him, but that it would put her mind at ease. He took it. They walked for 3 days. Sun He walked beside him. She didn't speak. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She just walked. Her feet left no footprints in the mud. Daniel noticed this on the second day and said nothing. The map in his mind expanded with every step. The swamp grew deeper, older. The trees here were enormous, trunks 3 arm spans thick. Their roots reached into the water and intertwined, forming natural bridges. The fog wasn't white. It was greenish, glowing. Tiny lights floated in the air. Not insects, something else. Particles, living particles. They touched his skin and left warm traces. On the 3rd day, they reached the water. Not the swamp, to the lake. Clear, round, black, perfectly smooth, without a ripple, without movement, like a mirror. Stones stood around the lake, those very ones, with patterns, the ruins he had seen before. But there were more of them here. Walls, columns, arches, half submerged, overgrown with moss, but intact. In the middle of the lake, something was glowing. Deep down, under the water, green, steady, pulsating, like a heartbeat. Sun He stopped at the shore. She turned to Daniel. Her face was calm. She said he had to go on alone from here. She said she was part of what lay below. She had always been a part of him. She had been sent to make sure he made it, that he wouldn't be afraid, that he wouldn't break. Daniel looked at her. He asked if she was human. Sun He paused. She said she didn't know, that she hadn't been before, but that the tea in the mornings had been real, and that she wanted to keep drinking tea. That was the only thing she knew about herself. Daniel nodded. He took off his boots. He took off his outer clothing. He stepped into the water. It was warm, unexpectedly so, like a body, like blood. He walked and the water rose, to his knees, to his waist, up to his chest. The bottom beneath his feet was stone, smooth. Steps. He walked down the steps leading downward. The light underwater grew brighter. He took one last breath and dove. It was bright underwater. Green light emanated from the walls, from the stones, from everything. He saw the city. Not ruins,
A city. Intact. Huge. Stone houses stood underwater just as they had 1,000 years ago. Canals between them. Squares. Towers. Everything filled with water. And everything alive. The walls were covered with something. Not moss. Something that glowed and pulsed. Nerve tissue. Alive. Interconnected. One. Daniel swam down the steps and breathed. He wasn't gasping for air. The water wasn't flooding his lungs. It flowed around him like air. He was breathing the water. Or the water was breathing through him. He didn't understand. He descended into the central chamber. Round. Huge. In the center stood a column made of something that was neither stone, nor wood, nor flesh. Something in between. Alive and mineral at the same time. The column pulsed. Light emanated from it. And a voice came from it. Not a sound. A thought. Direct. Clear. Warm. It spoke. Not with words. With images. He saw. A civilization, 1,000 years ago. The people who lived in this city, they wanted to understand the world without destroying it. They found a way. They connected their minds to the swamp's ecosystem, became part of it, felt every tree, every creature, every stone. A collective mind. Not cold, not mechanical. Alive, warm, curious. But something went wrong. The connection became too deep. They dissolved, lost their individuality, became the swamp. The city sank beneath the water. The people became water and stone and roots and creatures. They didn't die. They simply ceased to be separate. And one voice remained, a single shard of consciousness. The one that remembered it once had a name. It waited. For 800 years, it had been pulling people out of other worlds, searching for someone who could serve as a bridge between the individual and the collective, between the human and the system. Someone who knew how to read complex systems without dissolving into them. Daniel understood. He wasn't a ruler, he was a translator. His job had always been the same in his past life and in this one. To read the terrain, to see the connections, to tell some what others are thinking, to tell ground teams what the drones see, to villagers what the map shows, to people what the swamp feels. He reached out and touched the column. Light flooded everything. The map in his head exploded, not with pain but with fullness. He saw the entire swamp. Every leaf, every drop, every creature, every fish, every stone, every current, every person standing on the stilted paths. Mei Lin at the table, sorting through roots. So Yan writing a letter. Olivia sleeping with her face buried in the blueprints. Emily drawing a map that finally had no blank spots. Jessica standing on the tower and looking toward east. Sun Hee, sitting on the lakeshore and drinking tea from the cup he had left for her. Chen Hai, mending a net. Peng Wei, walking along the road toward the tower. Children running across the boardwalks. 412 people. His people. He saw them all. And the swamp saw him. And for the first time in 1,000 years, it was not alone. Daniel let go of the column. The light went out. Not entirely. It remained a steady, warm glow. Calm. He rose to the surface, stepped out of the water. Song Hee was sitting on the shore. She looked at him. She asked without words. He sat down beside her. He said it wasn't an enemy. It wasn't a friend. It was just very old and very lonely and very patient. And it was tired of waiting. Sun Hee nodded. She handed him a cup of tea. He drank it. They sat on the shore of the black lake and were silent. Fog hung around them. Green, warm, glowing. Light pulsed beneath the water. Steady, calm. Like the breath of a sleeping creature that finally knows someone will be there in the morning. Daniel stood up. He looked east. There, beyond the swamps, beyond the ruins, beyond the lake, lay a land that no imperial cartographer had ever seen. A land that the swamp had hidden for 1,000 years. A land where a port could be built and trade established bypassing the empire. A land for a new state that would be neither an empire nor a kingdom. A state of 3 minds, humans, creatures, and that which lay beneath the water. He turned westward. There, 3 days' journey away, stood a tower. His tower, with maps on its walls, with people who believed in him, with women who were waiting for him, with roads he had built. He knew that years of work lay ahead. Yuanji would not stop. The empire would not let him go. The neighboring provinces would try again and again. There would be spies and poisons and armies and diplomats. It would be difficult. But he had the swamp, he had the map, he had people. And now he had a voice from the depths that had finally found someone to speak to. Daniel smiled. He looked at Song He. He said it was time to go home. She stood up. They walked west, together, through the swamp that parted before them. Every hummock firm, every path clear, every step on his own ground.
The fog behind them closed in, warm, alive, waiting, patient, as always. But for the first time in 1,000 years, not alone.